Check, check. Good morning.
Good morning. Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday.
For you, Monday.
How you guys doing?
Remember, yeah.
Okay, we've just gone the half hour, so let's begin. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryankarvavahe Tejasvinavadidhamastu Mavit Vishavahe. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Okay, so we are continuing with chapter 21 of Vedanta Treatise, the final chapter in the text. Are there any questions on anything before we pick up with where we left off?
Can I ask any question?
Please.
Okay. Yesterday, I was invited to a dinner to a friend's place, and the conversation came up, and they said, "What is spirituality?" And I just found myself kind of giving unsatisfactory explanations, and I said, the person who has decreased his desires, the person who is less egotistical. But somehow it was, so that Glenn, once you had told us that if you want to learn something, then try to answer a question. And this was put to test. And it was not satisfactory. So I want to pose, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of ways of answering the question, what is spirituality? As to how I would answer it, it does actually depend upon the audience.
But these were all Indian, mostly Indian Americans, I should say, you know.
Yeah. I would say that spirituality is it's a practice. It's something that you're doing.
Okay.
What you're looking to do with spiritual practice is to use, if you like, tools or techniques that engage the mind and the intellect so that you rise to a higher level of human maturity. The way that you described it is essentially how I would also describe it, which is to say that what you're doing is rising above your selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
You're rising above your current view of what is real.
Mm-hmm.
There's the excuse me, the analogy that we always use is that of a parent and a child. A child has her current worldview, her current level of development, and that worldview essentially changes the way that everything is received and interpreted. As she becomes a teenager, the same world, the same people in her home and so forth, they get received and interpreted differently. Because the worldview has changed. It's less about me, and it's more of an acceptance of a reality. And so you can say that spirituality is to accept what is. It's an increasing acceptance, because the opposite of that is to resist what is because of what I want. So in that acceptance of what is, what's essentially happening is that you are gaining a greater sense of freedom. The moment you accept a situation or an event for what it is, you no longer resist it internally. So you are liberated from it. So all of spirituality is surrounding this word freedom. Spirituality is to be free from conditioning.
Uh-huh.
So it's important that we distinguish it from psychological maturity. Psychological maturity is, we can kind of understand it's the difference between being a child and being an adult. You become more psychologically mature. Spiritual maturity is your capacity to step back from the situation and view it objectively. And then you'll bring to bear on it whatever your current psychology is. But spirituality is your capacity to not be involved in something. And so that means that the spiritually evolved person isn't living in that same realm of involvement as you see others. So even when the spiritual person is fully engaged in action, they're fully engaged with their emotions, they're fully engaged in the world of ideas and thoughts. Being engaged doesn't mean the same as being involved.
Right.
They live, or their experience occupies a different place. What's another analogy here? If you've ever watched any of these old kung fu movies, or even actually modern action movies, you get to a point in the film where the good guy and the bad guy finally meet, and they're walking towards each other. And what do? They swap sort of insults. This will be your last day on earth, or your swords will never touch me, something like that. They're saying these things to each other, but that's not really, they don't care about the words they're saying. They don't care about the quips that they're making. They're attuned very, very keenly, waiting for the other person to begin to strike. So yeah, of course they're speaking and they know what they're saying to each other, but where is all of their attention? Their attention is very, very strongly placed in the observing and the waiting for the physical attack to begin, because they know it's coming. So how does this example relate? The idea here is that even though they are on the surface of it having a conversation, a back and forth of insults and rejoinders, even though it looks like they're doing that, one tiny thread of their attention is doing that. The bulk of their attention is sitting, poised, waiting for the moment where they have to draw their own sword, because the other person has begun to draw theirs. In a similar way, spirituality is to engage in the body, mind, and intellect, but for your attention to be resting somewhere else, poised, so that you're never fully involved in it. So it's our capacity, so spirituality is our capacity to be objective to the world. And the example that we always give when we talk about being objective to the world is watching a movie. Exactly. You're there, you're enjoying it, you're fully engaged, but you know something else that keeps you free from it. So spirituality is the practice of developing greater freedom from the known, and becoming more liberated, greater freedom as a practice It's the management of your attention so that it exists somewhere higher than the current engagement of body, mind, and intellect.
Could one aspect of that is also to recognize all is one, we are all one, that unity, or?
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the things that comes with it, I guess, if you want to put it that way. So yeah, there are a whole range of different concepts that you can apply.
Right.
And one of them is, yeah, exactly, unity.
Unity, yeah.
And once you have a sense of acceptance of anything, you are one with it. The opposite of acceptance is resistance. There's a sense of a gulf.
Right.
But the moment you accept something, it's another way of saying you embrace it. You are at one with it. So yeah, that idea of acceptance, or that idea of unity, yeah, they're very similar in that regard.
Yeah, so it's not kind of a quick one sentence. One has to explain.
It can be a quick one sentence. That's the thing. When I say, but for that to be the case, it would have to be your own quick one sentence.
But I like what you said was rise above the present condition and have your attention to a higher place. That probably sums it up.
Yeah, and it's a really good study practice. Yeah, I gave a sort of a raft of different ways of looking at spirituality just then, but it's a really good question. What is spirituality?
Yeah, people use it loosely,
Yeah, so for your own sense of your own practice, it's important for you to know what it is, so that for yourself you have a good description of spirituality.
Right.
And yeah, one that is nice and short, and then you can expand on that and explain it further, but you have a short, pithy description of what spirituality is for yourself. One of the ones that is most speaks most to me as a progressive journey is increasing autonomy and increasing empathy. That's essentially what spirituality is. Increasing autonomy, which is that freedom to be yourself, and autonomy is empathy is the capacity to reach out and connect with what is outside the individuality. And both of those they're two sides of a coin. And so from a perspective of short and concise, increasing autonomy and empathy. The problem with things that are short and concise is that you've done all the thinking to understand what that phrase means. And so if you deliver it to someone else, they haven't done all the thinking to get to what that means, so it might be misunderstood. So often you have to give a little bit of explanation as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Lalita, for the question.
Yeah, thank you. I know people sometimes this is not an uncommon word, People say, "Oh, he's very spiritual," but how many of us think about what is spirituality? That's another question. But I think, thank you, Glenn. That kind of explains the different ways, in a way, of looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah, probably one of the most accessible definitions, even if people don't necessarily fully get it, is exactly what you said, is the reduction of ego and egocentric desires.
Mhm.
And that's obviously straight out of Gita we talk about that verse where it describes that, but it's also easy for people to understand, is the rising above egocentric desires and ego.
Mhm. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. So let's continue with the text. Finite is infinite. He says, the finite presents itself as infinite. That may sound paradoxical, absurd, but on a careful scrutiny you find it to be true. You see infinite expression in the finite. Examine the mineral, vegetable, animal, and human kingdoms. Analyze their nature. You will arrive at the above conclusion. The mineral kingdom is made of matter, and matter is constituted of atoms. An atom is so minute yet packed with enormous power. The nuclear explosion speaks eloquent of that. Just imagine all the power contained in the countless atoms in matter. It seems infinite. Okay, so what's he doing in this section here? Finite is infinite. Gives us a bit of a clue. So he says that this reality, this consciousness, this Brahman that we've been talking about pervades everywhere. And it is infinite, unbounded. And so that infinite nature is seen throughout the material layers of the world. So he says the finite comes as infinite. And so the first thing he does here is look in the mineral kingdom, matter. So it begins to point us in this direction. Strictly speaking, all of the power contained in all of the atoms in the universe is not infinite, but it says here, he says it seems infinite. He says even in the realm of matter, gross material stuff, it contains a power that is well beyond the capacity of a human being to conceive of. How many hairs are on your head? I don't actually know, it might be, say, 10,000, 100,000. It's a lot, but we can conceive of it. How many grains of sand on the beach? How many stars in the galaxy, in the universe? How many atoms in the universe? You start to get to these larger numbers, it blows out the capacity of the intellect to understand. And so to us it seems infinite. This idea of infinite as beyond the capacity for understanding. Mineral kingdom seems infinite to us. In the vegetable kingdom also, there is infinite expression. A single seed can generate an endless chain of trees and seeds. Sow a seed in the earth, it grows into a tree. A tree produces numerous seeds. These seeds in turn can produce countless trees and seeds. The chain goes on endlessly. Just imagine all these emerging from one seed, a seed packed with infinite potential, infinite power. You perceive the infinite concealed in the finite. So this is a different sort of thing here. So whereas all the atoms in the universe is looking at a snapshot here in time, this is looking at the life of vegetable matter across time. Seed produces tree, produces seed, produces tree, ad infinitum. So that goes on infinitely. And as long as we allow for the conditions for the life to grow, what we see there is an infinite chain. He says you perceive the infinite. So it's interesting because we often talk about the idea that infinite means it cannot be grasped. Okay, you can't grasp infinity as such. But when you look at the vegetable kingdom, you can get a sense, an impression of infinity just by looking at 3 generations: seed, plant, seed. That's enough to give you that perception of an infinite chain. So what's he doing here? He's bringing our attention onto the notion of the infinite. We started the class by asking the question of what is spirituality? One of the things we touched on was this idea of where is your attention? A spiritual person is someone whose attention is on the higher. A spiritual person is someone who is seeking the truth of who and what they are. That could be one of the easiest, very short descriptions of spirituality. A spiritual person is someone who's seeking the truth of who and what they are. So how does this relate? The individuality has a finite aspect to it, and we believe ourselves to be constrained, limited. The philosophy has been saying all along that you're not this body, mind, intellect, you are the infinite self. So in order for us to begin to even approach this idea, we've got to start to bring our minds to the notion of infinity itself. And so by observing the mineral world, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, so forth, we can start to perceive the infinity in the finite. So it's moving our attention in that direction. So it is with the animal world. The wise see the infinite portrayed in the finite. A cat produces a litter of kittens. The kittens grow up into cats. These cats again produce many more litters of kittens. Thus the progeny goes on endlessly, innumerable cats emanating from a single cat. The same principle holds good for the human species too. A single human being can generate an endless progeny. You may be finite, but you display infinite potency and power. You would accept this infinite capacity in a human with respect to the past and the future, but not so with regard to the present. At present, you consider yourself to be a finite being with limited power and strength. This is not so. Even with respect to your present status, you seem to possess immense capacity, inexhaustible potency, infinite power. So just touching there on exactly what we just mentioned. The difficulty we have is in accepting the infinitude of our true nature. So let's at least start to look at where infinitude lies here in the world. Okay, plants, animals, okay, makes sense. The amount of power involved in the universe blows my mind. It's beyond. He says you can accept this sense of infinitude when you look across time with regards to past and future. But he says even in the present, that is still there. He says there is this immense power and this immense energy that we're all drawing on. He says, think carefully, analyze your day's activities, list them out. You woke up, had breakfast, drove to office, attended to your business, returned home, had a workout at the gym, showered, and now reading this book. Is that all? You answer, yes, that is all. Perhaps a few odd things I may have missed out, no more. Now follow closely. You have actually done much, much more, but not aware of it. You've been executing countless activities which you do not mention. For instance, your eyes have been seeing objects. Each time you see an object, you subject the cells in your eyes to a series of subtle actions before the sight is registered. M. Mitchell Waldrop writes in Science 85. Consider the capabilities involved in strolling down the road. Leaving aside such things as balance and coordination, you still have to see where you are going, which means you somehow have to make sense out of the ever-changing swirl of motion and colour and light and shadow. To accomplish this, you have at your command roughly 100 million receptor cells, the rods and cones and the retina of each eye. The retina also contains 4 other layers of nerve cells. All together, the system probably makes the equivalent of 10,000 million calculations a second before the image information even gets to the optic nerve. And once the visual data reaches the brain, the cerebral cortex has more than a dozen separate vision centers in which to process it. In fact, it has been estimated that vision in one form or another involves some 60% of the cortex. Of course, you remain blissfully unaware of all this. You simply glance across the street and say, "Oh, there's Sally." Okay. What's happening here is 2 things. He's drawing our attention to what the body is doing. In one aspect, sight. So we are not aware of what we're doing when it comes to simply registering an object in the room. If you can think of all of those operations actually mechanically happening, it's an immense amount of work that is being done just for sight, sound, smell, taste, all the senses. Not only that, but the mind and intellect also. As you are engaging with somebody, your intellect is at all times performing how many operations? I have no idea. But constantly performing operations in terms of how to relate to them. Listening, looking for cues as to what their underlying attitude is. Investigating your own ways to respond to it appropriately. You've got goals that you want to achieve. Everything's trying to happen. You've got all this going on, body, mind, and intellect. And what does it feel like to us? Someone's asked me a question about spirituality. I'm answering it. There's an incredible amount of activity going on. Again, it's like the idea of all the atoms in the universe. To try and conceive what is going on, it's an impossible task. So this is bringing our attention to the phenomenal power engaged in just being human. So it's a sort of analytical approach here. But at some point it gets to too much for the intellect to really comprehend. And so the intellect fails. It fails to comprehend really the amount of power that we are engaging with. There's the devotional aspect. So analysis, intellect, is to lead the stream of attention somewhere through reasoning, through questioning. Devotion is to surrender notions of I know, because there's a recognition it's beyond my capacity. This is another definition of spirituality. It's leading the stream of our attention to the unknown. He says all these activities emanate from you. You are responsible for them. Besides your eyes seeing, the other sense organs are also busy with their respective activities. They are again innumerable, countless. These activities are all yours. You have produced them. Furthermore, your mind entertains numberless feelings, emotions. You produce each one of them. So also your intellect conceives endless thoughts. You produce them all. Besides these, you are responsible for respiration and perspiration, eating and evacuating, digestion and distribution of food, etc. Countless cells in your body, hair on your skin, blood in your arteries and veins, all functioning through you. At this very moment, you are producing infinite actions. Remember this through your life. Realize this truth. What you consider as finite is actually infinite. You must recognize your innate nature, discover the truth in yourself. You are not a finite, limited, constricted being as you believe yourself to be. You are infinite. You are God Almighty. That is the truth. Hold that view at any cost. Do not compromise on truth. Assert yourself, I am all. I am everything. The microcosm and the macrocosm are in me. I am infinite. God. So once you start to, if you like, get into this frequency of what he's describing, that there is this mind-boggling extent of power and activity going on within the individuality, you can start to stretch it. Where does the boundary of who I am end? Everything that I'm doing is connected to an outside world. There's actually no real gulf. There's connection, otherwise there wouldn't be able to be the interaction. Arbitrarily, I draw the boundary at my skin, but I can extend it further than that. If I'm eating food, then that food becomes part of me, but at what point is it not part of me? Everything is connected to me in some way. Now, this is not looking from an egocentric, narcissistic perspective. It's the opposite. Egocentric, narcissistic, it's that I'm the center of the universe and it's all about me. This is not that. This is recognizing that just as there is an organ in your body doing its job, and another organ doing its job, and all together is this body, you start to see yourself as perhaps an organ in the body of humanity, or a joint in all of the mechanical nature of the universe. So rather than centering attention on yourself, the ego, what you're doing is losing that ego, losing that sense of being an independent unit by seeing that you're part of this incredible whole. He says, the microcosm and the macrocosm are in me. So that's the ultimate. And you can even look at this from again, the perspective of perception. And we've used this example plenty of times. If you hear a sound off in the distance and you want to strain to hear it, where do you place your attention? Okay, you close your eyes to help yourself focus, and then you take your attention not out there towards the sound, but in here towards the sound. The sound arises within you. Everything you experience is experienced within you. Again, take the example of dream state. When you wake up from the dream, it's easy to say, I was everything. The microcosm and the macrocosm were in me. Me, the dreamer, the microcosm, the dream world, macrocosm. Where did they exist? They all existed within me. In a similar way, there's that sense in which all this is occurring within my consciousness. So as we practice spirituality, it's just reminding ourselves of these ideas. We're not trying to force ourselves to believe something that isn't true for us. It's more a matter of imagination. You know, when you're playing with children, you play a game where you imagine you're a tree. Okay, now you're not trying to force yourself to believe you are a tree. You're just imagining you're a tree. It's very, very simple, very easy. It doesn't weigh heavily on you to do that. It's the same sort of thing here. We're not rushing to try and force ourselves to see some truth that we haven't seen yet. Not trying to impose a set of beliefs on ourselves. It's with a little bit of faith, and a little bit of analysis, imagining what it would be like to be the infinite, all-pervading consciousness, to be able to say, I am everything. The microcosm and the macrocosm are in me. He says, hold that view at any cost. Okay, any questions on anything before we move on to the next portion? Okay, so having talked about the very highest aspect of this philosophy now, he shifts gears a little bit and begins to talk about the characteristics of self-development. So perhaps you can think of it as having been inspired by these amazing ideas. How do I know I'm on the right track? How do I know I'm on the right track towards that? And so there are characteristics that will tend to develop in a spiritually evolved person. So these can be good pointers along the way. If we want to, we shouldn't be concerned about our level of spiritual development. That is counterproductive. It's actually getting into ego. But like any journey, we should be making sure that we're on the right track. So these characteristics will be a way of seeing our progress. He says, God realization is the ultimate goal of human evolution. Those earnest in reaching it wish to know their present state, but find it difficult to evaluate their spiritual status. They are unaware of their position in the path of evolution. Few understand what exactly are the traits and characteristics of self-development. Worse still, people have their own standards of judgment. Thus, many enlightened sages have passed into history unknown, unsung. Ironically, people attribute greatness where it is least due, conferred divine qualities upon spiritual charlatans indiscriminately, deify them as gurus and follow them blindly. Such following helps neither the disciple nor the guru. Do not fall a prey to such irrational practices. You cannot afford to commit such blunders. Try to understand clearly what constitutes the elements of spirituality, what marks the progress in the spiritual path. What are the chief characteristics of self-development? The true attributes of a spiritually advanced person. With the study and analysis, you would be able to assess the strength of spirituality in yourself and others. A few traits and characteristics of spiritual evolution are listed below for your guidance. So this is another really important aspect of the question that you started with, what is spirituality? Because if we don't have a clear understanding of the characteristics of self-development, then we'll confer spiritual status where it doesn't belong, and vice versa. We won't confer where it does belong. So if we don't think about it, then we'll fall into presumptions and assumptions that essentially serve our ego or serve our current mindset. The thing about spiritual growth is that we get to a place that we haven't experienced before. And so if we leave it up to our own imagination as to what spirituality is, we'll imagine it through the lens of our current level of development. You ask a 4-year-old, what does it mean to be an adult? Oh, it means you can have cookies anytime you want. And technically that's true. You can have cookies anytime you want. But what does the question and answer show us? The answer shows us that the child is describing adulthood through the lens of or from the perspective of childhood. Yeah, you can have cookies anytime you want, but you got to pay for them as well. There's something missing. So too, if we don't answer this question in a careful, analytical way, then we'll describe spiritual growth, in terms of our current level of ego. We'll just naturally fall into it. And so then when we see someone who conforms to that, we'll think they're spiritual, and they may well not be. In the same way as that someone who eats cookies all day, to the 4-year-old, they might look like, well, that's real adulthood. To real adults, we see it as irresponsible. So all of that to get us into this list of to get us into this list of self-development. So this is a great individual portion to study in this text. What we can do is to first of all understand each quality on its own, and then find some way of assessing where we stand. So you might give yourself a slider 0 to 10 and find out where you think you stand on that. And of course there's more than just this one. Of course, for each of them, give yourself a rating out of 10. And you might see specific areas that require particular attention that you can work on. And 6 months from now, a year from now, you can go through the same process and start to get a sense of how your progress is moving. So the first of these is self-sufficiency. As a person evolves spiritually, he develops self-sufficiency, becomes independent of the world around him. He stands out, a master of all he encounters in the world. Whereas a spiritually retarded person remains a slave of his body and its perceptions, his mind and its emotions, intellect and its thoughts. A self-developed person revels within his own self. His peace and happiness is not dependent upon anything other than his self. He does not crave for sense objects or emotions, thoughts or ideas. He remains ever free, unaffected by the manifold pairs of opposites that constitute the world. Be it pleasure or pain, joy or sorrow, honor or dishonor, only human beings have the spiritual potential to enjoy such independence. All other creatures are entirely dependent upon the world for their peace and pleasure. Okay, independent of the world around. So this is obviously meant in a particular way. Okay, as you become spiritually evolved, it doesn't mean you no longer have to eat food. Of course you do. Body needs to be nourished. So you are dependent upon the farmers, you're dependent upon the transport drivers, you're dependent upon the warehouse people, the stores, the people who buy your food, the people who cook your food. Without them, you would die. Your physical body would pass away. So what does self-sufficiency mean? And does that analogy follow through into the other levels of the personality, the mind and intellect? So the important aspect here, or there's lots of them, but let's look at this one here. He says, a spiritually retarded person remains a slave of the body, mind, and intellect. So self-sufficiency is the opposite of that. So at its most extreme, the opposite of self-sufficiency is addiction. The addiction is such that I can't function as a normal human being in any capacity unless the object of my addiction is being satisfied. I can't get up and go to work in the morning until I've found my cigarettes. That sort of idea. self-sufficiency is to rise above that and be free from it, to be independent of whether or not there are cigarettes. Take that simple idea and begin to apply it to ever more aspects of the world. He says at this end of this first paragraph, all other creatures are entirely dependent upon the world for their peace and pleasure. So that's the sense in which this is meant. There's an idea that we keep coming back to, which is that everything we're doing in life is for a sense of our own well-being. He says here, peace and pleasure. Where do we get that from? Where do we need it from? As we develop self-sufficiency, we're able to directly experience that sense of mental peace from within. As we grow spiritually, what's happening is the things that we needed in life, that were our genuine needs, in order to feel stable, in order to feel that I have a sense of identity, in order to feel peaceful, I no longer need them. And again, there's an analogy here when it comes to psychological growth. When you are a youngster, in order to feel peaceful, safe, you need certain toys. You need to have your parents around you. Okay, that might be the best example to use. Young children, when their parents are not around, some of them might find it difficult to even stay at a friend's home because their parents are not there. I've read surveys of young people, and one of the things that features strongly in things that they fear is their parents dying. Parents go away on holiday for a week and leave the kids in the care of grandma. Okay, they love grandma, but there's something missing. Parents are not there. There's a dependency upon the parents for their sense of mental peace, well-being, etc. As you grow up, what happens? Okay, you still appreciate your parents, but that dependence on them is not there. Now, that's just one relationship. Just because you're growing in independence from your parents doesn't mean that that's spiritual growth. That's psychological growth. Spiritual growth is to en bloc, shift away from dependence from, if you like, whole categories of the world. It's no longer needing, for example, the material world to be a certain way. In fact, he puts it back here. Do not crave for sense objects, emotions, thoughts, or ideas unaffected by the pairs of opposites that constitute the world. So it's touching on this idea that we brought in earlier of acceptance. It doesn't matter what the world brings. There is a sense in which you can move through changes gracefully, easily, because you don't depend upon the world being a particular way for your sense of well-being. So it's not just one aspect of the world, it's the whole thing. He says you gain self-sufficiency by focusing your attention on the self. The more you attune to the self, the less dependent you are on the objects and beings of the world. And by finding your union with the self within, you gain absolute peace and bliss. Nothing in the world can augment that supreme state of fulfillment. You become totally self-sufficient, truly spiritual. So it's an important point here to recognize that self-sufficiency is not dissociation. So it's not that we are sort of in a petulant way saying, well, I don't need anything. I'm fine on my own. This can be one of the ways that we misinterpret self-sufficiency or autonomy, is that we find it difficult to fully interact with the world, and so we withdraw from it. And in withdrawing from the world, that difficulty we experienced calms down. And so we think, this is much nicer. This is much more pleasant. I'll give you a simple example of this. I know someone who lives in a fairly rural part of, I believe it's Arizona or Colorado, and lives alone, no TV, no noise around. It's a very quiet, secluded area. And there's a sense in which he's considered to be very introvert, very self-sufficient. But, and I've heard him say this, when he goes to the center of LA and goes to visit his friends in Los Angeles, he can't stay for more than a week. The noise is too much. So that's showing the lack of self-sufficiency. He's dependent upon his environment being empty, sparse, quiet, unhurried. There's still a dependency there. So this touches on what we said earlier. Just the fact that a person can live alone in a rural environment with no entertainment of any description, we think he must be self-sufficient. Wrong understanding. It's actually an inability to connect with the busyness and the noisiness of the world. So self-sufficiency doesn't mean that we're not interacting with the world. It means that we can fully interact. We can be in all of the noise and all of the movement and remain balanced. It also means that all of this, if all of those things are not there, we stay balanced. So he says here, nothing in the world can augment that state of fulfillment. So you gain that self-sufficiency by drawing attention inward. If we're not drawing our attention inward, then what's happening is that the mind will naturally want to extend outwards and attach itself to things that look pleasurable, fun, interesting. Now again, the world of pleasurable, fun, interesting things is there. Enjoy it, contact it, but don't allow it to become a dependency. How do you do that? By always remembering yourself. Again, we were talking about this as what is spirituality? Spirituality is to be contacting or existing in a different place. What place is that? A remembrance of yourself. And you can do that in different ways. Part of it could be, who am I? That constant self-inquiry. You can use the examples from earlier on. Tree, seed, parent, child. You can get a sense of the infinitude of things. You're eating an apple or eating a meal with friends, and you're remembering the infinity associated with the food on the table. Potato to potato to potato to potato, infinitely onwards. This is just the last potato in a chain of hundreds of thousands of years of potatoes. Hold that thought at all costs. Now, where is that thought? It's within. So self-sufficiency means that you're anchoring your attention inwardly while engaging with the world. As that happens, as he says, things shift. The pairs of opposites go through their fluctuations. Because you're anchored inward, You're not so affected by things that change around you. He continues in that vein. He says, you may wonder, how can one remain unaffected by the world, become free from the persecutions of the body, mind, and intellect? Keep a balanced mind amidst trials and tribulations. The answer lies in spiritual discipline. Through spiritual discipline, you gradually detach yourself from the material equipments and their activities by attaching to the self within. Until you become established in the self, thereafter the world cannot disturb you. So yeah, spiritual practice. So part of it is that self-inquiry, who am I? That's the analytical, intellectual side of it. That sense of wonderment is the emotional, devotional side of it. And serving selfless action to the world, that's the physical component. If we're practicing those, then our attention is within. Because to practice discipline means we have to be observing what's going on inwardly with our thoughts. What am I looking at? What am I thinking about? So we're always taking the attention inwards as we practice spirituality. He says, as we grow through that, the world affects us less and less. He gives a final analogy here. He says, take the example of a coconut. When a coconut is raw, the kernel sticks to the shell. The bondage is firm. You break the shell, the kernel also breaks, but not so when the coconut dries up. When a coconut is completely dry, the kernel separates clear from the shell, becomes free. It shakes inside like a rattle. Now, when the shell of the dry coconut is broken, the kernel does not break. It remains as it is, unhurt, unaffected. The same is true of yourself. As long as you are attached to your body, mind, intellect, you are affected when they are affected. But when you detach yourself from them, you remain equanimous regardless of any affliction they go through. You gain your independence, liberation. He gives a similar analogy actually in the earlier portion of the text. A man's involved in a car accident. His car gets smashed, and that same evening he throws a party. And someone says, oh, what's the party for? Oh, my car got wrecked. What are you talking about? My car got wrecked. I am safe. Same sort of idea. What truly is important? The body can go through changes, yes, but that's not who and what you really are. Your true self isn't affected by changes in the body, changes in the mind, changes in the intellect. So as you identify more with the inner self, you don't change when the body, mind, and intellect do. You remain unaffected. It's like being in the center of that ride that you'll see at the fun fair, the centrifuge, the gravitron. Those people who are on the edges of that big spinning disc, plastered to the edge of it. The operator can sit right in the center and doesn't have any pull or push from the centrifugal force. Reside in the center of your personality. And then the world changes around you, but you feel balanced. Knowing who you are makes you self-sufficient. It's when we don't know who we are, then we feel pushed and pulled by the world around us. Okay. Next one is Universal Love, which we'll pick up in the next class. Any questions on anything before we conclude? Okay, thanks folks. As always, appreciate the attendance. We are back tomorrow 6 p.m. for Q&A, so if you have anything, please feel free to join in. If not, have a great week. I'll catch you next time.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you.
Have a good day. And Friday is 10:30, right? Now I know.
Yes.
Pacific
Yes.
Time.
Pacific, yeah. Although this week is, I think there's no class.
No class, okay.
But yeah, generally the Friday is 6:30 Pacific time. Sorry, 10:30 Pacific time.
All right, thank you. Have
All
a
right.
good week.